The new Danger Zone update brought a lot of changes to radar systems in War Thunder. Let's have a look at how to use the different types of radar and what they're for. First things first, I almost never ask, but please consider giving my channel a sub. It costs nothing and it really helps me out, even if you completely ignore the rest of my content. Anyway, there are caveats to a lot of what I'm going to present here. Some radar sets have quirky modes that don't function exactly like normal. They all have different ranges, filter ground clutter better or worse, and so on. We're going to be going over the basic general concepts here to get you up and running, but you'll still have to learn your individual plane's radar set. Before we even get into the radar, we have to look at keybinds. There are some important ones. At a minimum, you want to be sure you set Switch Radar IRST Search on-off, change Radar IRST Search Mode, Beyond Within Visual Range Combat, change Radar IRST Mode, change Radar IRST Scope Scale, select Radar IRST Target to Lock, and lock Radar IRST Target. These are a lot of keybinds to worry about, so you'll probably change them a bit over time just for convenience. Now let's look at the different types of radar displays. There are three main types, the first of which is the PPI, the Plan Position Indicator. This is the familiar slice of pie radar scope you've probably seen before, and represents a top-down view of the radar picture in front of the aircraft. Search radar and radar gunsights use this view a little differently, and this is generally the default radar scope in War Thunder. The line that moves left to right shows where your radar beam is pointing as it scans, and the different dots represent things that your radar sees, usually called radar contacts. The numbers on the bottom left indicate the horizontal and vertical scanning zone of your radar dish, and on the bottom right, you can see the current range setting of your PPI scope. We'll get into the letters up top in a couple of minutes. Next up is the B scope. This is also a top-down view of the radar picture, but it distorts it a little bit to fit into a rectangle, kind of like a flat map is distorted over a globe of the Earth. These are uncommon in gaming, but if you prefer to use the B scope, you have to turn it on kind of deep in your settings. You have to go into Preferences, Air Battle Settings, and toggle Use Rectangular Radar Indicator. It's defaulted to off, so if you want the B scope, you have to toggle it on manually. Since the B scope presents information completely differently than the PPI, I'll be going over the differences in each section. Third is the C scope. This represents a first-person view looking out forward in front of the aircraft from the point of view of the radar set. In-game, a couple of early radar sets give you the PPI and the C scope, but its primary use is actually with infrared search and track systems. For example, the IRST on the MiG-23 uses the C scope. Detected contacts are shown as dots, and the current scanning direction of the dish or seeker is also indicated with a slightly different dot. Now that we've covered the different types of scopes, we're going to take a look at different types of radar systems in order of complexity and how they display information. The first type of radar you're likely to encounter in the game are the early World War II era Dipole search units on some of the mid-tier German aircraft. These systems are incredibly basic. They only operate in search mode, and they present very limited utility in most game modes. If you look at the bottom right, you'll see the PPI radar scope. The letters SRC at the top indicate that the radar is in search mode. In this case, it's only mode. The 5 km on the bottom shows you the range setting. The curved lines on the radar scope indicate detected contacts. There's no indication if the contact is above or below you, and there isn't any ability to lock onto a target. This is a pure search radar, and the antennas are fixed, obviously, so there's no line moving on the scope indicating a scanning direction. Dipole radar works by projecting a constant field of radar energy, and it doesn't use a traditional radar dish. The curved lines on the scope indicate the radar contacts, and the smearing effect is radar energy reflected back from the ground, commonly referred to as ground clutter. In War Thunder, dipole search radar is pretty close to useless in arcade battles or realistic air battles, unless you have a complete rookie pilot without any points in awareness or anything. In simulator battles or flying close air support in ground RB, the dipole units become a bit more relevant as the targets aren't auto-spotted for you, and the radar set can actually help you find them. With the B scope, the dipole sets are much more difficult to use, as the smearing from clutter is much more pronounced, and contacts are displayed as a horizontal line, which tends to blend in with the smearing. You'll also notice that the range indication is at the top instead of on the bottom. Next we get to radar gunsights. There are always a lot of questions on the forums and Reddit about these, and most casual players just think it looks like a small radar scope that doesn't really show you anything. Radar gunsights only operate in tracking mode, indicated by the TRK on top of the scope, but some will say ACQ for acquiring target, but there's functionally no difference. You can see the scope range on the bottom. In arcade and realistic battles, the radar gunsight isn't really doing anything for you. The purpose is supposed to be to detect the range out to your target, which is then fed automatically to adjust your plane's gyroscopic gunsight. But this only works in the cockpit view, and it currently does not update your target reticle in external view, though I really wish that it did. The only information it gives you is a range measurement to the target. You'll notice in the footage that a little dot shows up on the scope when the target is right in front of the plane. That's all the radar gunsight does for you. This is supposed to indicate the range out to the target, but in arcade and realistic battles, you can automatically see the range to a target just by clicking on it, so the radar gunsight isn't giving you any information that you didn't already have. In any case, the target you have detected is indicated on the scope by an open circle. Now, something to note here, more advanced radar gunsights actually count as a traditional radar lock when they detect a target out in front of you, and you'll get a directional bearing on the circle, and it'll count as a radar lock for the purposes of slaving an infrared guided missile. I'll be discussing those two things later, so just keep this in the back of your mind. As of making this video, it's not clear if this is intended behavior or a bug, so it may change at some point. With the B scope, the detected target is represented by a solid dot, with the length of the dotted line coming up from the bottom indicating the range to target. Note that with the B scope, the advanced rangefinders do not give you the directional information about the target, but do still count as a radar lock for missile slaving. The same disclaimers apply that this may be a bug. Next up are basic search-only radar sets. There aren't very many of these in the game, so if you have one and you're wondering why you can't lock up a target, it's not you, it's the radar. You'll see on the top of the radar scope the letters SRC, indicating search mode, just like with the dipole sets. The degrees of detection on the dish are in the bottom left, and also the scope range setting is on the bottom right. Unlike the earlier dipole search radar, you get a line showing the sweep of the beam of your radar dish as it's displayed on the scope and moves across the sky. You also have some weird green lines floating in space out in front of you. Those are a visual indication of where your radar beam is searching at any given second, and I'm going to discuss those in more detail later on. These search-only radar sets display detected contacts as dashes or dots, depending on how advanced the radar is. So it's a bit more complicated and accurate than the dipole radar, but that's really all they do for you. On the B scope, the dish angle, radar mode, and scope range are all on the top of the scope, with the dish beam visible as a vertical line that sweeps left to right. Contacts are shown as horizontal dashes. Otherwise, no major differences. Now we're going to look at a more regular radar set. This is probably what you think of when you're thinking about radar. The radar has a search mode, just like we've talked about before, but you can also hit your keybind to lock a target. This will put the radar into tracking mode and attempt to lock the target either directly in front of you or that you have selected on your radar scope, which we'll talk about in a minute. You'll see either TRK or ACQ on top of the radar scope and some green flashing corners out in front of your plane. This is called the targeting frame, and it shows where your radar is pointing to try and lock up the target. Some radar sets will only stay in the tracking mode for a second or two, with the targeting frame blinking for just a moment before going away, while others will toggle the targeting frame tracking on or off until you flip it with your lock radar keybind again. That feature, with the frame staying active until it's turned off, is called Boresight Targeting, often called ACM in the game, which stands for Air Combat Maneuvering Mode. If you hit your keybind and the green corners blink out on the screen for just a second and then disappear, that means that your radar tracking is one of the models that only stays on for a second or two, and you'll have to try again if you miss locking on. If the green frame corners blink and stay out there, your radar is fixed in tracking mode and will try to lock the first eligible target inside of the targeting frame that it can find. While in tracking mode, your radar will not be searching, so you won't get contacts updated on your scope. What tracking mode actually does is it basically just points your radar dish in one direction instead of sweeping it around. Some radar sets will still sweep it around, but only a few degrees off of center. A small number of radar sets will show you the PPI or the B scope and the C scope at the same time. And this is actually a good example of how tracking mode works, as it shows the dot representing your radar's beam direction just hovering in the center of the C scope. Most radar sets that let you toggle tracking mode instead of just flicking it for 2 seconds at a time will list the Boresight feature on the radar's info panel in the game as ACM mode, which indicates you can toggle the Boresight frame on or off with the keybind for radar IRST beyond within visual range combat. This particular bit of information, the nuance of ACM and BVR in respect to Boresight targeting, is perhaps the single most differentiated feature among radar sets in the game. So there are a lot of caveats to what I just said with the different radar sets. Play with it in a test flight to verify how your specific plane's radar handles Boresight mode. Some regular radar sets also let you change the sweep angle of your dish, using the keybind for Change Radar Search Mode. This will switch between some presets for how far up and down and out to the sides your radar dish will scan when you're in search mode. This can be useful if you're trying to find things at longer range directly in front of you, and narrowing the scan angle of the beam will let you find contacts faster. Some will also have different range presets for the scope, and you can cycle through them with the Change Radar IRST Scope Scale keybind. Now, those floating green lines we mentioned before, let's talk about those. Those show you where your radar beam is actually pointing at any given second, and you'll see them change if you change your search angle. This is similar information to what you would get on the C scope, but without any contacts displayed. And you can use this to help determine if a contact is above or below you if you haven't picked it up visually yet. So let's talk about locking up a radar target. First, you need to select a target. If there's only one thing in front of you, this is easy because it'll be selected by default. If you have more than one radar contact, there are two ways to pick one so that you can lock it. The first is the default method. Use your keybind for Select Radar IRST Target to Lock. This will cycle through the available targets on your radar scope. The currently selected target will have two lines around it like a little bracket. Then you hit your keybind for Lock Radar IRST on Target, and you'll get the lock. The second option is to use manual radar queuing, and this is a little bit more advanced. First, you have to enable it from your options menu under Air Battle Settings. Then you want to turn off the checkbox for Target Cyclic Switching of Aircraft Radar. It's defaulted to being on. When you turn that off, you can manually move the targeting brackets on your radar scope using some additional keybinds. You'll need to set the horizontal and vertical radar IRST target Q control axis keybinds. Once this is done, you can literally just move the targeting bracket around on your radar scope, get the target you want inside of it, and hit the lock radar IRST on target keybind as normal. Unfortunately, there isn't a keybind to switch between these two targeting methods, and you have to go into your options menu and hit the little switch similar to the radar B scope. When you actually lock up a target, a few things happen. First, you get a solid green square displayed around the target, and your radar display will stay in tracking mode, displaying only the locked target on the scope. Locking up a target does a few important things for you. First, it gives you a very accurate measurement of the range to target, displayed in the top right of the locked targeting frame. You also get an indication of the relative speed on the bottom right of the frame. Positive numbers mean that you're getting closer together at that speed, while negative numbers mean that the target is flying away from you. You also get a target movement indicator below the frame. It's a little green circle with a line indicating the direction the target is moving. Not all radar sets provide this, but most do. You'll also notice on your scope, if your radar set is advanced enough, your locked target will be displayed as a little circle with a line in it. The line indicates the direction that the target is traveling in. This is an open circle on the PPI display and a solid dot on the B scope. Also, some radar sets will give you a weapon range indicator on your scope, showing an estimate of the range on your currently selected missile against the locked radar target, based on the speed and direction information. The maximum and minimum ranges are displayed, but keep in mind that these are estimates, and if the target turns or something, it can change pretty dramatically very quickly. On the B scope, this is displayed a little bit easier to read. You get a longer horizontal line on the right-hand side of the scope representing the distance to the target, and the two shorter horizontal lines showing the maximum and minimum ranges of your currently selected weapon. Another thing to keep in mind is the current range setting on your radar scope itself. If you have, for example, a range preset of 60 kilometers on your scope, and a selected missile with a range of only 3 kilometers on the target you have locked, the range indicator on the scope is going to be so small that you won't even be able to see it. If your radar can change scope ranges, it's often useful to set it as low as possible in dogfights for exactly this reason. Please remember that locking a radar target isn't foolproof. A lot of factors will impact whether or not you can achieve a target lock on a radar contact. This is a much larger topic, but in brief oversimplified form, target direction can impact your ability to get a radar lock, especially for the look-down modes we'll talk about in a minute, as well as ground clutter, the size of the target, and chaff countermeasures, in addition to how far away it is. Obviously, some radar sets are simply better and more advanced than others, and can lock up targets more easily. A few radar sets have an advanced capability to scan while tracking. The example we're looking at here is the RP5 radar set from the MiG-19. It kinda cheats, and is actually two small radar sets, one dedicated for search and one dedicated for Boresight target tracking. This gives you the ability to continue searching while you're tracking a target. You can see that even when locking a target, it still has a second scanning beam going from side to side on the scope. This is not the same as the advanced track while scan mode found on more modern radar sets that we'll talk about in a moment. Now we're going to check out look-down, shoot-down radar modes. The first is MTI mode, which stands for Moving Target Indication, and is indicated by the letters MTI above the radar scope. This works by storing the radar signal in a buffer for a fraction of a second, and then comparing it to the signal that comes in a fraction of a second later. It then filters out any of the data that doesn't change, which in effect removes the ground from the radar's sight picture leaving only moving targets. Ingenious, but it has a weakness. If a target is moving away from the radar at close to the speed that the radar is moving, it will look to the buffer like the target isn't moving at all, and it'll be filtered out like ground clutter. If you're having problems locking a target with MTI at low altitude in a tail chase or close to a tail chase, this is probably why, so turn your MTI off. When your MTI is on, you'll notice that ground clutter is basically completely filtered out on your radar scope. The next is basic lookdown mode, indicated on the top of the scope as LD. This is not Doppler radar, and its basic lookdown functionality uses a signal processing technique called analog envelope detection to try and compensate for ground clutter. It does not filter out the ground clutter completely, and you'll still see it on your radar scope. It just tries to deal with the interference more effectively by using some electronic signal processing. And generally speaking, if your plane has the basic lookdown mode like this, you'll find it a lot more effective at locking up radar contacts that are below you. This brings us to Pulse Doppler radar mode. This is an advanced radar mode indicated by the letters PD above the scope that uses Doppler shift to detect targets flying low to the ground. The easiest way to explain it is that Pulse Doppler radar detects the target's movement relative to its surroundings rather than detecting the target directly. In our context, it detects the velocity of an aircraft relative to the zero velocity of the ground behind it. You'll also notice that with Pulse Doppler mode on, ground clutter is completely removed from your radar scope. But, like the MTI mode, there's a weakness. A target flying at 90 degrees side to side across the radar's field of view will look like it has a velocity of close to zero compared to the ground, since it doesn't appear to be getting any closer to or farther away from what's behind it. Taking advantage of this is an advanced technique called Doppler notching used to avoid detection, which I'll be discussing in more detail in another video at some point. But for now, the simple thing to understand is that if you have Pulse Doppler on and the target you have locked seems to simply vanish off in the distance, it's because they turned too far sideways. Try turning off the Pulse Doppler mode. A few advanced radar sets also support Pulse Doppler velocity mode, indicated by the letters PDV above the radar scope. This is essentially the same as Pulse Doppler mode, but instead of measuring distance to the target, it measures the relative velocity with the target. The way this is currently implemented in War Thunder seems a little oversimplified compared to how it's supposed to work in real life, so please keep in mind that the PDV mode is likely to change in the future, but right now, as implemented in the game, it functions very similar to regular Pulse Doppler mode. It's just displaying different information for you. This brings us to Track While Scan mode. This is an advanced radar mode only available on a small number of aircraft that allows you to select a target for missile launch while still scanning and getting a full radar picture of available contacts. In short, you kinda get a half target lock while scanning. Your selected target will have a small set of brackets around it, the same size as a radar lock frame, but not the full square. The intended use for this radar mode is to select targets for active radar missile launch and give data link guidance to multiple missiles at the same time. It's also useful as it allows a better visualization out in front of you, showing what target you have selected, instead of needing to try and read the scope, so that you can do regular radar locks a bit more accurately. Now some notes. Selecting, but not locking, a target allows you to designate the target for an active radar missile, such as the AIM-54 Phoenix, before launching it. Selecting, but not locking, a target also supports radar slaving for infrared heat seekers, so you can designate a target for weapons lock without doing a full radar lock on it. You cannot fire or guide semi-active radar homing missiles using Track While Scan. You need to use a traditional radar lock for that, but Track While Scan can make it easier for you to pick out a target for the regular radar lock. The last mode we're going to discuss is infrared search and track. This is an uncommon feature which is currently only available on a very small number of aircraft. Use your keybind for switch between radar and IRST. While not technically radar, it uses the same interface as the radar system in-game, so I'm going over it here. IRST uses the C-scope display with the letters IR displayed above it, and shows you contacts relative to the forward-looking point of view of the IRST sensor. This is a passive detector that detects the heat of targets, generally their engine heat, so it doesn't have any way to measure range. You can't use the IRST to guide a semi-active radar missile, but you can use it to slave an infrared heat seeker, presuming the missile has the slaving feature. IRST has scan and track functionality similar to a basic radar set, with the caveats I just mentioned. IRST will also not trigger a radar warning receiver, so your target won't be alerted to your tracking, and the IRST also does not suffer ground clutter. Another thing to keep in mind, IRST systems can currently not be used to target ground targets. The last thing I want to mention is slaving an infrared missile to a radar lock. I have a separate tutorial on using air-to-air missiles in War Thunder, which will be getting updated soon, but I want to mention two very basic things here. If you have a radar lock on a target, and an infrared missile selected as your active weapon, and the infrared missile is modern enough to support this feature, you can use radar slaving to make a weapons lock easier. This happens automatically, and it's one of the primary reasons to bother with radar in close combat. The short explanation is that if you have a radar lock, your IR missile's target reticle, that's the smaller of the two circles, will snap to your locked target before launching. The lock won't help you guide the missile, but it will help target the missile more easily before launching. And a few times in this vid where I've mentioned radar slaving, this is the feature I was talking about. Well, that about wraps things up for now. I realize this was a pretty long tutorial, but hopefully it gave you a good foundation for radar basics in War Thunder. If Gaijin makes any major changes or overhauls the radar interface in the game again, I'll try to post an updated version of this video. But for now, this should still be mostly current as of the Danger Zone update. As always, thanks for watching.